In this video, we're looking at Operation Linebacker II, also known as the Christmas bombing, which happened during the Vietnam War in December 1972. This was a big 11-day bombing by the U.S. on North Vietnam's main cities to force them back to peace talks. We'll explore why it started, what happened during the bombings, and the big effects it had afterwards. This operation is famous for its intense action and the big debates it caused about right and wrong in warfare. Join us to discover more about this critical moment in history. By 1972, the Vietnam War had been raging for nearly 2 decades. The U.S. had spent years fighting alongside South Vietnam to stop the communist North Vietnamese forces, but victory was nowhere in sight. In early 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a massive military attack that threatened to defeat South Vietnam. In response, the U.S. launched Operation Linebacker I, a bombing campaign that targeted supply lines, bridges, and transportation routes. This slowed down the North Vietnamese advance and forced them into peace talks in Paris. For a while, it seemed like the war might finally end. But by December, the negotiations had collapsed. North Vietnam refused to compromise, believing the U.S. was desperate to withdraw. President Richard Nixon and his top advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw this as a major problem. If the U.S. left Vietnam without a peace deal, it would look like a defeat. Nixon decided to take a drastic step. If North Vietnam wouldn't agree to peace, he would force them. The plan was to launch a new bombing campaign, one that would hit North Vietnam harder than ever before. This time, it wouldn't just be about cutting off supplies. The goal was to destroy North Vietnam's war-making ability and make their leaders realize they had no choice but to return to the negotiation table. The U.S. would target Hanoi and Haiphong, the heart of North Vietnam's government and industry. The operation was set to begin on December 18, 1972. Over the next 11 days, North Vietnam would experience the most intense bombing of the entire war. What followed was one of the most controversial military operations in American history. Operation Linebacker II, later called the Christmas bombing. With the peace talks failing, President Nixon was determined to bring North Vietnam back to the table, on American terms. He believed the only way to do this was through sheer military force. If the U.S. could hit North Vietnam hard enough, its leaders would have no choice but to surrender to negotiations. This time, the strategy was different. Operation Linebacker I had focused on cutting off supply routes and disrupting troop movements. But Operation Linebacker II would be a full-scale assault on North Vietnam's war-making ability. It was designed to crush their infrastructure, cripple their economy, and break their will to fight. The main objectives were clear. Destroy North Vietnam's military and industrial centers. This meant targeting factories, rail yards, and warehouses. Wipe out air defenses. North Vietnam had advanced Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, SAMS, that had been deadly to U.S. aircraft. These needed to be taken out. Force Hanoi back to the negotiating table. Nixon wanted a peace deal that ensured South Vietnam's survival. To achieve this, the U.S. launched one of the biggest air campaigns in history. Over 200 B-52 bombers, along with thousands of fighter jets and support aircraft, were sent into action. These bombers could carry massive payloads and drop hundreds of bombs in a single mission. For 11 days, wave after wave of bombers would pound Hanoi, Haiphong, and other strategic locations. More than 20,000 tons of explosives would be dropped. No other bombing campaign during the war came close to this level of destruction. The U.S. military believed that such an intense bombing campaign would quickly overwhelm North Vietnam's defenses. The North had anti-aircraft weapons, but against hundreds of bombers, their chances looked slim. But North Vietnam had been fighting for decades. They were used to war, and they were prepared. As the first waves of American bombers took off, North Vietnamese gunners and missile crews were ready to fight back. The stage was set for one of the most destructive and controversial air assaults in military history. Would the bombing succeed in forcing peace, or would it only harden North Vietnam's resistance? The answer would soon become clear. On the night of December 18, 1972, the first wave of B-52 bombers and fighter jets roared into the skies. Their destination, Hanoi and Haiphong, the heart of North Vietnam's war industry. The operation had begun. For the next 11 days, the U.S. launched wave after wave of bombers, each carrying up to 108 bombs. The goal was total destruction, to cripple North Vietnam's ability to continue the war. The bombing followed a strict pattern. Every night, the B-52s flew in formations of 3, dropping thousands of bombs at once. These formations, nicknamed cells, created an effect known as carpet bombing, massive explosions that covered entire areas, leaving nothing but rubble and fire. Key targets. The U.S. targeted 4 main areas in an attempt to crush North Vietnam's war effort. 1. Rail yards and supply depots. These were essential for transporting weapons and supplies from China and the Soviet Union. Destroying them would cut off reinforcements and force North Vietnamese troops to fight with fewer resources. 2. Factories and power plants. Hanoi and Haiphong had industrial centers producing weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Blowing up these factories would cripple North Vietnam's ability to produce weapons. 3. Airfields and anti-aircraft defenses. The U.S. needed to weaken North Vietnam's air force and missile systems to make bombing runs safer for American pilots. Striking air bases helped reduce the threat of enemy fighters. 4th, military headquarters and communication centers. These were the nerve centers of North Vietnam's war effort. Destroying them would disrupt enemy leadership and coordination. The bombing's impact. The destruction was immense. Each night, American bombers dropped thousands of bombs, turning key areas into burning wastelands. Hanoi and Haiphong were shaken to their core as buildings crumbled, fires raged, and smoke filled the air. Even hardened North Vietnamese officials were shocked by the intensity of the attacks. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and thousands of civilians were killed or injured. Hospitals and homes were caught in the destruction, leading to international outrage. But the bombings did their job. Rail lines were cut, supply depots lay in ruins, and weapons factories were no longer operational. North Vietnam's ability to sustain the war was in serious jeopardy. However, the U.S. paid a price. The North Vietnamese were not defenseless. They had one of the most advanced air defense networks in the world, supplied by the Soviet Union. As the bombing continued, they fought back with deadly force. The U.S. was winning the battle in the skies, but at a heavy cost. As the relentless waves of B-52 bombers thundered over Hanoi and Haiphong, North Vietnam refused to surrender. Instead, they launched a fierce counterattack, determined to inflict as much damage as possible on the American forces. A well-prepared defense, North Vietnam had spent years preparing for massive U.S. airstrikes. With the help of the Soviet Union and China, they had built one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. Their arsenal included surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. These deadly weapons could track and destroy bombers midair. Anti-aircraft guns, positioned throughout Hanoi and Haiphong, these cannons filled the sky with deadly flak, forcing American pilots to fly through walls of exploding shrapnel. Fighter jets, Soviet-supplied MiG-21s attempted to intercept and disrupt U.S. bombers. Radar jamming and decoys. The North Vietnamese used fake targets and radio interference to confuse American pilots. Heavy American losses. The U.S. military had believed that overwhelming firepower would prevent serious losses, but they underestimated North Vietnam's defenses. On the first night alone, North Vietnam launched over 200 SAMs, forcing many bombers to take evasive action. By the end of the campaign, 15 B-52 bombers had been shot down, the largest single loss of B-52s in history. Each B-52 carried a crew of 6 men. When a plane was hit, some managed to eject and parachute down, but many were captured upon landing and sent to prison camps. One of the most infamous locations was the Hoa Lo prison, known as the Hanoi Hilton, where American POWs were often interrogated and tortured. For U.S. air crews, the fear of being shot down and captured was constant. Pilots flying into Hanoi's airspace knew they were entering the most dangerous skies on Earth. The bombing continues. Despite these losses, Nixon refused to stop the bombing. He was determined to break North Vietnam's will, no matter the cost. Even as American bombers fell from the sky, the missions continued night after night. By December 29, 1972, after 11 straight days of relentless bombing, Operation Linebacker II came to an abrupt stop. The skies over Hanoi and Haiphong fell silent. The U.S. had dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs, destroying key military and industrial targets. But more importantly, North Vietnam's leaders were shaken. The question now was, had the bombings worked? North Vietnam's response. At first, North Vietnamese leaders tried to appear unshaken. They claimed the bombing had only made them more determined to fight. They showed foreign journalists images of bombed-out neighborhoods and mass civilian casualties, hoping to turn global opinion against the U.S. And it worked. International outrage was growing. Even U.S. allies like Britain and France criticized the bombing, calling it excessive and inhumane. Within America, the operation was also deeply controversial. Protests erupted as images of burning cities and injured civilians spread across the news. However, behind closed doors, North Vietnam's leadership was in trouble. The destruction had been far worse than they admitted. Their war economy was crippled, key supply lines were destroyed, and their Soviet and Chinese allies were pressuring them to return to the negotiating table. Back to the table. Just 4 days after the bombing stopped on January 2, 1973, North Vietnam signaled that they were ready to resume peace talks. This was exactly what Nixon had wanted. He believed the bombings had forced the North Vietnamese to finally accept a peace deal. On January 8, 1973, U.S. officials led by Henry Kissinger met with North Vietnamese diplomats in Paris. The negotiations moved quickly this time. Unlike before, there was no more stalling from North Vietnam. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The terms included a ceasefire in Vietnam, the withdrawal of all U.S. troops from South Vietnam, the release of American POWs held in North Vietnam, recognition of South Vietnam's government, though North Vietnam's troops were allowed to remain in the South. Victory or defeat? For Nixon, this was a major win. He had used brute force to bring North Vietnam back to negotiations, securing a deal that allowed the U.S. to exit the war without outright surrender. But not everyone saw it as a victory. The war did not truly end. Fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. And just 2 years later, in 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive and captured Saigon, ending the war on their terms. In the short term, the Christmas bombing forced peace negotiations. But in the long run, it could not stop North Vietnam from winning the war. Operation Linebacker II was one of the most intense and controversial bombing campaigns in history. It proved that air power could force an enemy to negotiate, but it also raised serious moral and strategic questions. A military success? From a purely military standpoint, Linebacker II achieved its objective. North Vietnam returned to the negotiating table within days of the bombings. The Paris Peace Accords were signed, and U.S. troops were able to withdraw from Vietnam while securing the release of American POWs. Many in the U.S. military saw it as proof that heavy bombing could win wars. Some officials even believed that if the U.S. had bombed North Vietnam this way years earlier, the war might have ended sooner and on better terms. But others disagreed. While the bombings forced negotiations, they did not defeat North Vietnam. Just 2 years later, the North launched a final offensive, captured Saigon, and won the war. This raised the question, did Linebacker II actually change anything in the long run? The controversy, one of the biggest criticisms of Linebacker II, was its brutality. The bombings caused massive destruction, not just to military targets, but also to homes, hospitals, and civilian areas. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured in Hanoi and Haiphong. International media broadcast images of burning cities and wounded children, sparking global outrage. Even inside the U.S., the operation was heavily criticized. Many Americans saw it as senseless violence, arguing that the U.S. was destroying cities just to force peace talks. The operation became a symbol of the darker side of U.S. war strategy, a reminder of how far a country might go to achieve its goals. A lasting impact. Despite its controversy, Linebacker II shaped modern air warfare. The strategy of using intense bombing campaigns to pressure enemies has been repeated in later conflicts, including the Gulf War and Iraq War. Operation Linebacker II was one of the most brutal and decisive bombing campaigns of the Vietnam War. It forced North Vietnam back to the negotiation table and led to the Paris Peace Accords, allowing the U.S. to withdraw its troops. But in the long run, it did not stop North Vietnam from winning the war. The Christmas bombing remains one of the most controversial military operations in history. Some argue it was necessary to pressure the North, while others see it as excessive and inhumane. Regardless, it proved the power of air warfare and set the stage for future U.S. military strategies. What do you think? Was it a necessary evil or a brutal mistake? Let us know in the comments. Thanks to everyone who watched until the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical content. See you in the next one.